And I'm in Flaccavento. And as I said, I've been joined by three of my colleagues here, and we're going to focus today on the kind of highlights, the high-level findings from our report, Can Democrats Succeed in Rural America? Now, I want to say, first of all, for context, that there were some bright spots for progressives, rural progressives in this election of a couple of months ago. One of them, probably the best known, John Fetterman. He didn't just win and fairly resoundingly, but what not everybody knows is that Fetterman used a very sort of John Deanish strategy of every county, every vote. And so he spent a great deal of time in small towns and rural communities, visiting them at least once and many of them twice. And he also used the kind of language that many of the candidates we highlight in our report use: straightforward, plain talking, simple and to the point. Another example of a success in a primarily rural district was Eric Sorensen in Illinois 17th. Now, this was a seat held for a number of years by Sherry Bustos, another fine representative who's also an advocate for much greater connection, empathy, and involvement in rural, and she's been followed now in this seat by Eric Sorensen. And the third kind of bright spot, a lot of folks haven't heard of this remarkable young woman named Marie Gluesenkamp Perez. She is almost a model candidate by RUBI's standards from what we've learned about what works and what does not. She won in Washington State's 3rd congressional district, a district that had been in Republican hands for the last several cycles. And again, Marie has got a lot of the qualities that seem to work in rural areas. A small business owner, she and her husband own an auto body shop, very laser focused on local concerns and particularly kitchen table concerns, and very much a plain spoken candidate. So we had some success stories. I'll mention one more, and this goes back a couple of cycles ago, but our own Chloe Maxman, who's a member of RUBI, and Chloe won in 2018 and 2020, first in the State House of Maine and then in the State Senate of Maine, using a focus not only on kitchen table issues, but a tremendous effort to knock on every door and to really, first and foremost, listen to people. And that won her seats in the House and the Senate in districts that had been Republican for a long time and that voted for Trump. So again, good news, and it's possible. That's kind of the takeaway. But it ain't all good news, because the fact of the matter is, one-party rule continues across the vast, vast majority of America's countryside. A few quick statistics that just kind of represent that. Virginia flipped to a Republican governor and lieutenant governor and attorney general in 2021. Compared with 10 years earlier, when 4 counties in Virginia voted 70% or more for the Republican at the top of the ticket, by 2021, 44 counties went 70% or more, all of them rural. And that's an 11-fold increase. We've seen this trend not only in Virginia, but across the country. And we've seen it not just in rural, but among working class voters, where support for Democrats has been slipping steadily for quite a long time now, down to 33% in the 2020 election. And that's critically important because the working class still makes up actually slightly over 60% of voters in most elections. And it isn't just white working class voters. In fact, Democrats have been losing ground the last few election cycles with working class voters of color, particularly Latinos, but also African Americans. And so this is a problem that goes beyond a question of race or racial anxiety or anything like that. So by 2022, we got to the point where nearly 70% of rural voters were selecting Republicans and making the vast majority of the country one party. Another way of looking at it is just over time from 2006. And again, what you see is a steady slide in Democratic support in basically small towns and rural. So our report was a deep dive into exactly how this has come to be, and then what we can do about it. What are the success stories? What are the common tools and strategies that seem to work? I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Cody at this point.
So just to talk about the methodology here briefly, there are two parts to the report. The first part was compiled through 50 interviews of rural candidates, mostly Democrats, who outperformed the partisan lean in their district by at least 5 points in sort of Trump era races. So 2016 through 2020, but there were also some off-year elections in there as well. Most of those candidates did far better than 5 points over the partisan lean, but that was sort of our cutoff for who we were looking at. Part two is a compilation of basically everything you could ever want to know about rural elections and rural politics, how we got here and how we can get out. Let's talk about some of the key findings of the candidates themselves. These shouldn't be that surprising, but the successful candidates were generally well-known and well-regarded in their districts. Now, that might mean that they ran for office, a different office previously. It might mean that they were elected mayor in one of the local towns or on the county council of some kind. But it also might mean that they were members of their community in visible ways, but less political ways. A couple examples. One was worked at the local grocery store for 20 years. So saw everybody come through and get groceries. Was well regarded and well liked in that role. Another one ran the local grain elevator. So it's not necessarily that they were in politics before, but they were just generally well known and well regarded in their community. Probably the most important thing about these candidates is, as people, they prioritize listening before attempts to persuade or really get their own message across. We heard time and time again from these candidates that when we asked them what their agenda was when they were door knocking, they said, I didn't really have an agenda at the door. I wanted to learn from the constituent, get to know them, what their concerns are. And this doesn't just create a good impression of the candidate themselves. Their constituents realize that they care about their own interests, but it also helps reinforce what the priorities of the community are in that candidate. So the candidate learns a lot as well, of course. And these candidates could tell you everything there is to know about their districts, from the economy to the geology, to the culture, to the politics. So they really knew these districts well and had often grown up there or had spent a lot of time there. Now about the campaigns themselves. In the 21st century, there are a lot of ways to contact voters, but personal contact is still king. Door knocking was huge for most of the successful candidates that we talked to. If you're in a statewide race, that becomes more difficult, but some sort of personal touch in contacting voters. You got to get in front of them. You've got to make sure that they understand you as a human being. And that was a huge part of what our candidates did. I want to make a couple notes about the personal contact as well. Even in very rural districts the doors are spread out and far apart, our successful candidates still prioritize door knocking. It's a lot harder than in town, but they would drive from long driveway to long driveway to knock on those doors. That was really key for those candidates. In terms of the consultants they worked with, most of the successful candidates shied away from sort of the national inside the beltway consultants and were using folks that were local and had local knowledge. And in terms of the media that they utilized, really focused on local media, local newspapers, local radio stations. And lastly, in terms of issue selection in these campaigns, they really did a lot to reflect the interest of their constituents. All that listening at the door paid off in terms of they knew which issues to talk about with their voters. These candidates don't come to their campaigns with an agenda already set. I know what's best. This was not the attitude of these types of candidates. They were very much reflecting back to the community what the community cared about. I'm going to pass off to Erica at this point.
Great, thanks, Cody. Hey, everyone. So I'm going to be talking about communications. We've got in part 2 of the report a ton of detailed examples of communication best practices, but for right now, I'm going to share just a few highlights. So number 1 is successful candidates tend to be plain spoken and avoid political jargon and polarizing rhetoric. They talk like a neighbor, not an activist, is kind of our motto here at RUBI. And so the first part here is pretty self-explanatory, talking like a neighbor, not like an activist. But I want to show you an example of what I mean by non-polarizing rhetoric. Next slide. So I know some of the text here is a little fuzzy, and I will read out a portion of it in just a second. But just to explain what it is, this is a very no frills mailer that was sent out by a group called the Center for Voter Information, very generic and nonpartisan sounding. And what they do is just straightforwardly compare and contrast the candidates. Sorry,
can I see this later? I hope so.
Oh, someone just needs to get muted there. Okay, thanks. The candidates' positions on one or more issues. So like in this one, they're comparing Gretchen Whitmer's position on book banning, the state budget surplus, and repairing roads and bridges. And so just to read out the blurry part there under banning books, it says, do the candidates support allowing politicians to ban books they don't like from public schools? Gretchen Whitmer, no. Tudor Dixon, yes. That's it, the end. They do not then go on to say, Tudor Dixon is a fascist nut job who doesn't want your kid to be allowed to read Captain Underpants, right? They're just providing the information and letting the voter draw their own conclusions. And this type of mailer has proven to be phenomenally successful with swing voters and is really underutilized. And we would like to see more of this kind of thing. Next slide. Successful candidates communicate with fewer words. They tend not to go into detailed policy proposals. They sell the brownie, not the recipe. That is something that the messaging expert, Anat Shenker-Osorio, says all the time, and she is so right about that. So, for example, if a candidate is talking about paid family leave, they're not going to say, research shows that access to paid family and medical leave is associated with physical and mental health benefits for new parents, improved maternal and infant health, decreased child and family poverty, and long-term development pathways for women and non-maternal caregivers. That's a mouthful. Instead, they will say, paid family leave means that you'll be there to see your baby smile for the first time. Next slide. Number 3, successful candidates stand up for multiracial working class against the rich and powerful. And we have found that there are different ways of doing this. One is the race class narrative that we did a briefing on a few months ago. Another is the common sense solidarity approach that we also did a briefing on last year. And then the new kid on the block is the winning jobs narrative. And the common thread in all of these approaches is that the candidate makes it clear that they have the backs of ordinary people and are willing to challenge corporate greed and corruption. And we have a lot of examples of different language that can be used to put forth that idea, different variations on the theme in part 2 of the report. Next slide. Number 4, the candidates focus on whatever issues local people care about. Cody talked about this already. We on the left tend to get preoccupied with the issue of whether candidates should focus more on abortion or inflation or threats to democracy. But what we found is that there's really not much use in debating these in the abstract. What a good candidate does is figure out what's top of mind for their voters in their district, and they focus on that. So it might be abortion, it might be the price of milk, it might be keeping the local hospital open. The campaign platform is locally driven. And number 5 is they honor workers. And this recommendation comes largely from the Winning Jobs narrative, which is an ongoing project led by the Rural Democracy Initiative. And one of their top recommendations that we think makes a ton of sense is to honor workers and make them the heroes of the story. Not corporations, not politicians. It's the workers who are the protagonists who bring good things to life, like the old GE ad. It's not the GE executives, it's the workers. And I want to show you a couple of examples of campaign ads from the midterms that I thought made really good use of some of the Winning Jobs principles. So if you stop screen share, Anthony, I'm going to share my screen and bring up a couple of short ads that are kind of fun. This first one is from Hillary Scholten. She won in an upset in Michigan's 3rd congressional district, which that district includes Grand Rapids and then also some suburban and rural areas. So here we go.
When it's made in West Michigan, it's built to last. I think it's time Congress work.
Erica, can you start it over again? Let it load since it's. For me, at least, it's bogging down.
Whoop. Okay, I'm going to try it again. It's sometimes this just happens with videos, but I'll try it again.
When it's made in West Michigan, it's built to last. I think it's time Congress got back to valuing that kind of hard work and the quality that comes with it. Bringing supply chains home will lower costs and create long-term opportunities for all our families. That's not politics, it's just common sense. I'm Hillary Scholten, and I approve this message. I'm asking for your vote because together, we're building a West Michigan where our best days are still ahead.
What was that okay, Anthony?
Yep.
Okay, now I'm going to show you one more. This one is from Sharice Davids. She won in Kansas's 3rd congressional district. And it's not really a rural district, but it's a good ad. So we're going to take a look at it anyway.
It's 6 a.m. and up on this overpass, these guys are already at it. Starting early to beat the heat, staying late because that's what it takes. I'm Sharice Davids. I worked with local officials, Republicans and Democrats, on a plan to fix bridges and roads like this all over Kansas. Then worked with Republicans in Washington to pass it. Keeping these guys on the job and boosting our economy. I approve this message. They work hard and work together. Washington should too.
Okay, that one play okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. So just one critique I had of David's sad that most of you probably noticed too, is that all the workers in there were white men, which doesn't make sense when 1 in 5 of your voters is not white and half are women. But that's something that's easy enough to fix. And I think she struck the right tone with the focus on workers and also with the focus on bipartisanship, which I know can be a dirty word on the progressive left. But in a district like hers that leans Republican, it really makes sense to try to depolarize the electorate. So that is it on communications. Humility, depolarization, sell the brownie, not the recipe, and show ordinary people that you have their backs.
Thank you, Erica. So that's it for our presentation. Now, keep in mind, this is a dramatically reduced version of the report. And we do think that not just the executive summary, but the report itself, which is a solid 100+ pages, is really worth it, particularly for candidates and their staff, but also for just concerned folks who want to kind of turn the dynamic around this rural urban divide, because there's really the substance, the details, the examples are in the report itself. But we hope with that little taste there that we've got folks interested with questions. So we'll start now. Jackie, maybe you could help us get the ball rolling with a see if you've spotted any questions in the chat box, and then we could all be looking for them.
You guys are going to provide the slideshow as well, correct?
Yes, absolutely. The report, there's a question about how to get the report itself. At some point, Jackie, if you would put the link to the website, the RUBI website, you can go there, and there's actually 3 tabs on the homepage. One is for the executive summary. The second is for the first portion of the report, as Cody described it, the one that has the distillation of the candidate best practices. And the third is the background research. Erica led that part of the report, and it's extensive. So you can look at any or all of them just by going to the RUBI website.
So Justin asks, has there been any reactions from traditional DINs like the DNC?
To the report, is that the question?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well,
Hi, Anthony.
hi, Justin.
How are you? Yeah, it has been too long.
So at this point, we have disseminated the report through our own network at RUBI, but also through lots and lots of colleagues in this space who've been working on different elements of the rural-urban divide and on rural politics. And we know that it's been circulated with several thousand people. We don't know if it's made its way up to the DNC and to the national organs. We continue to work on that and trying to get an audience there, but I can't say that we know that. We know some state party folks who've become more colleagues with RUBI, have received and commented favorably and are sharing it in their own way. That's happening in Virginia and Indiana and Nebraska at a minimum, probably some other places as well. I'm just going to grab some of these questions, and others can as well. And this is in no particular order, but Ernie has asked if the urban strategy is very different from this. And I would say, in a word, yes. I'll let Erica and Cody comment as well. There would certainly be commonalities. I think that successful candidates in urban whose districts are more urban and suburban still often are good listeners, still let their constituents know that their point of view is truly valuable, that they're coming to their door or to a town hall meeting to learn as much as to talk. So I think there would be some common threads that people who have won in more mixed districts would also attest to. But some other elements would be, I think, fairly different, including the fact that simply door knocking is a lot more feasible in districts that are dominated more by larger towns and cities.
Just to add to that, I think one of the big differences is just strategic focus. In urban elections, Democrats are often much more focused on base turnout, and you just can't only focus on that in rural elections. Now, we think the things that we have in the report turn out the base and persuadables, but that persuasion element has to be a part of a rural strategy for Democrats. Just that the base is just not big enough to only do base turnout.
And Cynthia's question, and Cynthia, you may also, Cynthia Wallace with New Rural Project is a core member of RUBI as well. You may want to comment on your own question, but Cynthia's question that whether or not we've looked at messaging as it relates to mid-year elections versus a presidential year. And she's commenting that in a midterm, it's harder to get the casual voter to turn out than it is in a presidential. So maybe you should be a little flexible about the message. First, Cody, did you want to comment on it, because you really structured the interviews, and 2 of the 3 cycles we looked at were presidential years, and then there was one in between. Anything that jumped out in terms of differences among them?
We did not systematically cut the data that way. There is like a sort of tangentially related thing that we sort of noticed. It wasn't really enough to put in the report heavily, but it looks like it is advantageous for Democrats to challenge incumbents in off-year elections or mid-year elections, not the presidential cycle. That appears to be advantageous because the base turnout in those districts is just heavily Republican in presidential years. So we actually see a little bit of advantage for Democrats in off-year elections or non-presidential elections. But that's not really getting at your question, Cynthia. This is maybe a great idea for some follow-up research.
Yeah, and in terms of the third-party research we were reviewing as well, basically like all the polling and message testing, I would say the vast majority of that was testing that was done for the 2022 midterms, and a lot of that built on and sort of refined learnings that had been done for the 2020 cycle. So I would say offhand, I didn't see any big differences, just sort of like refinement of the same strategy, progressive populist strategy, kind of moving in that same direction. But like Cody said, no, we didn't do a side-by-side comparison. It's an interesting point we might want to look at.
I want to move into the next set of questions in the chat box. I do want to comment again about this recording itself. The slideshow as part of this larger recording that we're doing, including the interaction with you all, will be up on RUBI's website probably by Monday or Tuesday of next week. When you go to the website, you can not only download the report, but if you go to, I believe it's the resources tab, you'll find a number of things, including this briefing and pretty close to every other one we've done. And there's some really great stuff. So you can review that. I don't know for sure, maybe somebody else on the team does, whether we'll actually email out the slide deck. But I do know that this, the slide deck and the whole recording will be up on the RUBI website by early next week. Now we have a question about opportunities to interact with voters at churches. I'm going to again defer to Cody and Erica to see if there were any specifics on that in either the campaign part of the report or the broader research.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of our candidates did church events. Certainly in rural areas, churches are often a community center, and our candidates tried to meet voters wherever they could and everywhere they could. So there was a lot of that.
Okay, the next question's about whether there was challenges getting competent staff. I'll say that one issue that was clear was this preference for local staff, wherever possible, staff and consultants. There's a universe, I know from being a candidate, of not only consultants, but people who jump from campaign to campaign. And frequently what happens is, whether you're looking for a campaign manager or a finance director or a communications director, you can find some really, really skilled and competent people in the mechanics of campaigns, but the vast majority of them don't have much experience, if any, in rural campaigns. And so what some of the candidates did was to go more for local talent for many of their key campaign positions. And then it was kind of on the job training. People learned as they went to the particulars of using the voter databases, of cutting sheets for calls and walking, et cetera, the things that you do. Certainly that was part of my campaign and others. I don't know if there's any broader trends on that you want to comment on, Cody, in terms of whether there are also challenges finding competent staff for some of these candidates.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that there was. I mean, a lot of the candidates, especially state legislature candidates that we interviewed, had minimal or no staff. And a little tidbit I'll just add that's a little bit relevant to this is that you'll notice we didn't really talk about fundraising. Strong fundraising did not appear to correlate with success in our study, which is, we didn't want to make that a central point of the report, because I think it's always good to have strong fundraising and to have funds to do things. But we were a little bit surprised to see that those things didn't really correlate. So they did struggle to find staff, especially, like I said, at the state legislature level. Higher up, they often had staff. And of course, some of the statewide, Senate candidates that we interviewed had extensive staff. But often they did struggle. Yeah.
Patty's question: how do people from cities help RUBI and associates reach rural areas of our state? She's in Durham, North Carolina. I'm going to say one thing, and then I'm going to ask Cynthia, if you're still on the call, to come off mute. And we don't have time for you to talk extensively about new rural project, but you might want to mention if there is some opportunity there for that. One thing you might want to consider, if you yourself or your Democratic committee or your local nonprofit that you're a part of is more urban or suburban than it is rural, is you might want to consider taking RUBI's Rural Urban Divide training. This is something we've been doing now for 2 years. We've done it in about 40 different specific, not places, because a lot of it's been virtual, but 40 different trainings. And what that does is it helps people who don't have much understanding or familiarity with rural issues really come to understand in a pretty deep way why we have this divide. Why are so many rural people very, very negative or mistrustful about liberals, about progressives, about Democrats? And very importantly, what the heck do we do about that negativity, that divide? And so what people at a minimum can do to help what RUBI is trying to do broadly, I would say, is to consider reaching out through the website to host a rural urban divide training. We've done them for folks in the countryside and lots of times for folks in the city. Seems to be really helpful in both places, both kinds of areas. And of course, simply circulating the report, because part of our challenge is that not every liberal in rural America is condescending in their language or makes presumptions about rural people. But the brand that Democrats and liberals and progressives have in rural area is very much influenced by what any liberal anywhere says on social media or mainstream media. And so to the degree that city folks undo some of the negative viewpoints or some of the negative baggage, that can really help the broader effort. Cynthia, did you want to add anything, since you're in North Carolina and maybe a particular connection with Patty?
Thank you. And so happy New Year. Good to see you guys. Awesome work by RUBI. Just amazing in the report, etc. I would say, Patty, I've dropped my email in the chat as well. And there are several groups like New Rural Project. We work in the Sandhills area of North Carolina. So that's kind of the North Carolina, South Carolina border area. But there are other organizations that are also doing rural work that are across the state. So we'd love to try to connect some of our urban friends with some of those organizations. Though if we look at the results of 2022, some of the urban areas need some work too. So Sherry Beasley could have used a little more support. So her results might have been a little bit different from some of the urban places. And we're excited. This year, we're going to make it happen, Anthony, and we're going to bring RUBI to North Carolina as well. So we can't wait to work with you guys to do some trainings here as well.
Great, great. Patty, keep your eye out for that. Get in touch with Cynthia. She and her colleagues at New Rural Project are doing just incredible work, just incredible. Okay, moving, we got a lot of questions still, and I really appreciate all these folks using the chat for that. Bob has asked, how important has it been shown to mobilize young voters and how to best use them in a campaign? And I'm not sure that we have data on that. We all certainly know that there's a lot of challenges around mobilizing young voters. I will mention one thing and then see if Erica and Cody have anything to add to that, which is that a recent addition to the RUBI group of partners we call our folks around the country is a relatively young fellow named Paulo Promidis, and Paulo's organization, which is called the Outrun Coalition, is rural focused, but specifically focused on getting young candidates, candidates of color, and LGBTQ candidates within rural areas to run for office. Frequently local office, sometimes state office. I'm not sure if they've done any federal yet. And so I would say within RUBI, which does not have a particular expertise around young voters, it might be worthwhile through our website to connect with Paulo and talk with him, because that is definitely part of their focus. Cody, Erica, anything to add about this young voter question?
You know, I think we do have a little bit about it in part 2 of the report, but I'm not remembering the particulars. One thing I do remember is that we kind of challenge a little bit of the kind of dominant narrative that, you know, young voters are our salvation and we just got to turn them out and we're just going to win and get tired of so much winning. There's some truth in that, but I think it tends to get overstated. And when you really look at the numbers, it's not necessarily the holy grail. And with rural in particular, like with adult rural voters, you know, I think it's important to go into it not making any assumptions about what young rural voters want based on, you know, national trends and talking points, but again, specifically, you know, talk to young rural voters and find out what they want, and then work from there.
Thank you, Erica. The next question is from Dan. Hey, Dan. As underdogs, I assume he means Dems in rural, did candidates interviewed avoid controversial issues as much as they could in order to try to keep things positive? I'm going to say one thing about that and then let Cody and Erica fill in a little bit more. So this is a big question. The big question is sort of, do you go there when it comes to abortion, when it comes to guns, gun safety, gun rights, when it comes to some other issues? One thing I will say that seemed quite clear is that what successful rural candidates did not do was to toe the party line and sort of hammer away at a particular message about those controversial issues. Again, the listening posture was first critical. And the second thing was that it was essential that people who did differ on the controversial issues fundamentally felt respected by the candidate. So when you don't reach common ground, you do at least have a sense of respect. And maybe that respect opens the door for the individual to consider some of the candidate's other positions, the candidate more broadly. Cody, you want to round that out, fill in some details there?
Yeah, Dan, I've been excited about your question since you posted it. Yeah, candidates did not avoid the controversial issues. And we don't really have time to go into exactly how to message around them right now. There's some more stuff in the report about that specifically. But on every issue, there's really a way to talk about it in a way that decreases its salience as a conflict point. And there's a way to talk about every issue that increases its salience as a conflict point. I think probably for a quick way to think about that would be Erica's book, Beyond Contempt. If I can just plug Erica's book, but it's all about the listening posture, as Anthony talked about, and where are you trying to go with that conversation? In any given conversation, you're not going to persuade somebody out of an issue that they've or a position they've held their entire lives, but you can move the needle a little bit, and the mutual respect is really key there.
Yeah. Republican central campaign and fueling the culture war, that's kind of maybe a clue that that's not, they think that that's going to work to their benefit. So if Democrats just get right in there and, make that the center of their campaign too, and keep kind of re-inflaming those issues, then that's really playing into the Republican candidate's strategy. It doesn't mean you can't talk about it at all. I mean, I think people do need to be really authentic and clear about what their position is. Say, this is what I believe. This is why I believe it. I understand if you see things differently, and I would like to work with you on these other issues where we might see eye to eye. So I think that that's the way to handle it. Oh yeah, and then I'll also mention there's a group that was a real stand-up on this called Galvanize Action, that created all of this really funny content for social media. It was around critical race theory and guns and a few other issues. Check it out in the report, because it's when you can use humor in a way that's not like snarky and condescending, but just something that everyone can laugh at, that has a way of kind of diffusing the issue. And they found their creative content to be really, really effective at moving the needle, particularly with white, moderate, rural women.
Thank you.
Can I just say something really briefly just on this topic about, I thought the celebratory posture of Democrats while Republicans were struggling to find a speaker was pretty problematic. That type of like jeering of a dysfunction, like I think we can all use it as an example of why we don't want Republicans in power. But that type of jeering posture is precisely the type of posture that increases this conflict and doesn't help us in rural elections.
Thank you. Yeah, 100%. So the next two questions are different, but there might be some overlap here. And I don't know if Chloe is still with us, but I'm going to suggest that if she is, she might want to come off mute and help us respond to this. Chloe was one of the candidates we interviewed, and she's a legend in her own right. The first question is, do rural people usually answer the door to canvassers? And the commenter has said that in Austin, it's about 25%. That's Vanessa. I think in general, the response rate at the doors is low, Vanessa. I don't know if it's lower in rural, and I don't know if we have data. I'll let Cody comment on that. And then Karen's asking kind of a question that is definitely about what you do at the door. What happens if you encounter somebody who's nasty, who's racist? Should you just walk away? Or should you stick around and try to change their mind? That's a heck of a good question and a tough one for sure. So Cody, first of all, is there any difference that we saw and Erica in the deeper research about response rates at the door? Do rural people open their doors less or more, about the same?
We don't have that information in terms of the data. I would say though that candidates who did door knocking, which almost all of our successful candidates did, always had something to leave if there was no answer at the door. So there's a question later about mailers. Some candidates swear by mailers and really ascribe a lot of their success to them. But definitely having something to leave at the door when you've tried and no one has answered is important.
Chloe, are you with us? Would you be willing? Because I'm thinking of some of what's in your book and some of what you've talked about in the briefing you did with RUBI, not so much maybe about exactly the second question, but the fact that you and other successful candidates were willing to go to doors where the first impression might be that's probably a nasty racist person at that door, and the encounters don't always turn out that way. Chloe, are you there? Can you come on and comment? Sounds like maybe she's not. Maybe she's had to jump off.
I can just say one more thing about that. There's not. I don't think we addressed that specifically in part 2 of in the report. I do have a lot of stories in the book I wrote about this, Beyond Contempt, about conversing across lines of difference. And there are some really moving stories in there about people who were able to diffuse bigotry and so I think it's personal decision for the canvasser, the person who's at the door, whether they feel safe, whether they have the equanimity and patience that would be required to deal with someone who's throwing bigotry their way. But there are some really inspiring stories, and I do think it can be done.
There has to be a real willingness to kind of suspend a lot of what you're thinking. There's a really interesting story that Jalecia Ward, who has been active with RUBI in the past, she's busy with other things right now, tells when she was running for a state house in Eastern Virginia, and not specific to knocking on a door, but she was at a public hearing in their community about whether or not to keep Confederate statues. And she happened to sit next to a guy who had either MAGA hat or a Confederate hat, I don't remember which. They both in turn spoke their very different points of view about the Confederate statue. But prior to that, they had begun chatting such that the gentleman felt really inclined to listen to her more, asked her if they could continue the conversation in the parking lot. They did, and eventually got back to her and said he was going to vote for her because he found her to be so thoughtful and respectful in how she approached this difficult subject. So kind of a unique and interesting example of that. David asks, were there any questions in the survey that got at the longstanding conflict between kind of big ag, industrial ag, and farmers who are regenerative in nature? And there were not survey specific questions. I don't know if any of the encounters or the campaign events or anything, Cody, surfaced that tension or that issue at all that you recall?
I don't recall any conversation with the candidate about that specific issue. Many of our candidates were farmers, but I don't remember this specific issue coming up.
Thank you. Incidentally, David, we'll be doing our rural-urban divide training in February in Ohio at the Ohio Ecological Food and Farming Conference, and it'll be the first time we've done the training specifically and primarily to a group of farmers. So it should, I'm sure this issue will come up then in the context of our training. Dave asks, are there any actions or activities that you'll be focused on or encouraging during the in-between time of non-election years? Absolutely, Dave. In fact, RUBI is really not primarily driven by election cycles. We do try to contribute to better outcomes for progressives and liberals and Dems when there are elections, but that's not our raison d'etre. That's not kind of our core. We have activities going on all the time. Again, the trainings, which I've mentioned a number of times, there's nothing quite like them in the country. And we do them with local Democratic committees, with state parties. We do them with environmental and social justice groups. We do them with rural coalitions. So those are a feature that are going on every month of the year, all the time. The other one is a new initiative we're launching. I won't go into detail about it, but we're incredibly excited about. That is what we call our Community Works Initiative, where we're going to be working directly with local Democratic committees and local groups to move beyond, or let's say create a whole portfolio of work that is nonpartisan, non-ideological, not tied into specific campaigns, but that is entirely about those local groups of Dems and liberals engaging with other members of the community to solve local problems. This Community Works Initiative has started to happen in a few places where we've been kind of getting to know folks and maybe done a training, but we're planning to launch it in a more systematic way this spring. And that will be ongoing year-round work that we will be helping to catalyze and support, and we hope becomes just a feature of what local liberals and Dem groups